Hi friends, Tristan here. Today I'm going to be bringing you a podcast about the topic of esports in a bubble. It's a very interesting topic that I have researched throughout this semester, and it's one that interests me greatly. So, by the way, ignore the blanket. I'm a little cold, not feeling great, but we march on anyway. So, as we talk about the topic of esports being in a bubble, we first have to examine what an economic bubble is for those of you who may not be familiar. It is a sort of foreign concept. Probably not many people have heard of it. And then we will hit on the two factors that have led esports to be in this bubble. And I'll explain more on that as we go. So quickly, what an economic bubble is that essentially it is when you have an asset, and as it relates to esports, it will be like a player, their salary, an esports athlete, their salary, or a spot in a franchise league, and I'll explain more on what those are as we go, don't worry. But a bubble is when you have, is when the price or cost of that asset greatly exceeds its actual value. So that may be a little difficult to understand. It might seem a little weird, like what does that mean? I'll relate it to actually a commercial that aired nationally on television earlier in 2019. It was a commercial done by the folks over at Gainbridge. Gainbridge is, if you don't know what they are, basically they are just a service across the country that basically lets people invest in the stock market and things of that nature. And they manage your account and things like that. So that would be similar to like E-Trade, Charles Schwab, things like that you may have heard of. But they did a commercial earlier this year where the commercial is set in the 17th century, somewhere over in Europe. I'm pretty sure it was England somewhere. And the beginning of the commercial shows a peasant farmer wheeling a cart manually down a road. And a carriage, a very nice horse-drawn carriage, stops next to him. And a very important, wealthy-looking man leans out of the carriage and says, "You there, how much for those tulips?" Because the farmer was wheeling tulips in that little cart. And the farmer looks at the man and he says, "Oh, they're $1 each." And I'm going to use dollar because they didn't use dollar back then, but just for making it easy, $1. He said, "They're $1 each, sir." And the wealthy man in the carriage bought all the tulips off the farmer. And so we then see the farmer go to the pub or the bar or whatever, and he sits down next to his friends and he's so excited and he's like, guys, I just sold all my stock of tulips. This man bought them all for double the price. I'm rich." Because they're really only worth 50 cents. But the farmer tricked the man into buying them for $1 each, double their worth. So he obviously came away much better on that deal than he should have. And so what then happens is that people hear of this wealthy man buying tulips for this price, and other wealthy people start buying tulips, and the demand just goes up and up and up for tulips. Suddenly people are going crazy over a tulip, a flower. But people aren't really familiar with them, so it's sort of new. And that's a key part to a bubble, is that it typically forms around something that's very new. In today's world, that would typically be a new technology, like you could read about the .com bubble, as it were. There was a bubble around the internet when it was first sort of becoming prominent. But yeah, these people are continuing to buy the tulips for more and more and more. And, wealthy people are buying them, and then suddenly commoners start buying them. Everybody has tulips, and the price keeps going up. And we see later in the commercial, there's an auction for tulips, and people are wagering their house for a certain amount of tulips. And crazy things, until one man speaks up at the auction house. He silences everybody, and he says, "What's the big deal about a tulip? It's a tulip." And then everybody goes, oh yeah. And then suddenly, no one wants tulips anymore. The price plummets, they're worth nothing, and people who made their livelihood on those tulips are now in severe pain, for lack of a better word, or they're not well off because their entire business sort of fell out from under them because now people aren't buying tulips. So this is how this relates to esports is, first off, let me finish the background on the bubble really quick. So we have I told you about the Gainbridge tulip commercial, and that's a very good comparison. You can look it up on YouTube if you would like. And as I mentioned, it often happens in new technologies and industries, like there have been housing bubbles and obviously, like I said, the internet. And these sort of happen from when different kinds of investors get involved that buy into these things. There's three main ones, and it's not limited to these. All kinds of people invest in things like this, but it's sort of roughly these three investors. You have knowledgeable investors, and those are people that understand the asset or the industry that they are investing in, and they understand its true value. And then we have the second kind, which is roughly the same as the knowledgeable investor, but they're either unaware of the prospect of a bubble, and they invest a lot of money anyway, or they are aware and they choose to ignore it because they see it as a quickly growing industry. Going back to the tulips, people didn't necessarily think about the worth of a tulip. They just bought it because people were buying it, and they said, I'm getting in on this. And then the third kind is the sort of investor that has no understanding or very little understanding of the asset and industry that they are investing in. Pretty much all they see is a quickly growing industry, and they want to get in as soon as possible because they want to get profit because they see it as very quickly growing. So those are roughly the three kinds of investors that we have in esports. Now, how it relates to esports, we're going to get into that now. First is player salaries. People are often mystified when they hear of esports players making incredible salaries, and rightfully so, because in some cases the numbers are quite outrageous. And what we found is that at the top level, in top games, in the most popular esports games, these are League of Legends, Overwatch, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, Dota 2, Call of Duty. In these games, in these different esports scenes, players are making way more money than they're worth, than they're bringing back for their organization. It's like buying tulips for a crazy amount of money, but in reality, it's just a flower. These investors and teams are paying their players crazy amounts of money, 6-figure, 7-figure salaries in some cases, when that player doesn't bring anywhere near that much profit back to the organization to justify that their salary, if that makes sense, if you're following me. So esports salaries and player salaries have been widely regarded as at completely unsustainable levels by insiders within the industry that are very familiar with the situation. Quickly, just to mention a League of Legends player by the name of Honey, he just signed a deal with Team Dignitas for $2.2 million over 2 years. He's going to make over $1 million a year to play League of Legends. And that would be fine, theoretically, if Honey were to bring in $2.2 million himself back to the team. But that's just not happening. So that's why these sort of, it's like a business. The business has to make sense. You have to be eventually, maybe not right away, but you eventually have to be making money. And that is where those figures like the $2.2 million don't make any sense, because investors are just shelling out for these players, but they're not getting anywhere near that much back from them as a result of them, being on the team. And so that's where we talk about the concept of a return on investment, which is basically just the investor getting their money back and starting to turn a profit on the asset that they invested in. And really the only reason that these salaries are possible right now is because we have we have an industry of investors in esports that are just swimming in cash. Venture capital firms and other very wealthy people from the sports world, the entertainment world, they're coming in and they're making these massive investments into the industry, and they're without really knowing much about it. That goes back to our different kinds of investors. And so the only reason that this is currently working is because these investors have mounds of cash to burn right now. And they're willing to take a loss on it because they still see esports as a growing industry, something that they are convinced will turn them a profit and blow up in the near future. But right now, the players' salaries indicate that, and the way that, you know, how they're 6-7 figure salaries, these indicate that these return on investments aren't going to happen because, quite frankly, the teams are not getting sponsorships, endorsements, money back to the organization that they're paying out. So they're losing money, and they're losing a lot of money in a lot of cases to keep players on. So that is the player salaries aspect of it. They are vastly overpaid for what they're actually worth, which is creating a bubble. And then there's another aspect of the bubble, which is franchise leagues. So a franchise league, just think of the NFL, the NBA, MLB, major pro sports in the United States. Excuse me. Those are franchise leagues. And in esports, we're starting to see those rise. We have the LCS, which is a franchise league for League of Legends in North America, the OWL, which is the Overwatch League, as well as the CDL, the Call of Duty League. Both of those are sanctioned by Activision Blizzard, the makers of StarCraft and other games like that. And what's happening with the franchise leagues is that the LCS, for example, is charging roughly $10 million to organizations, teams to buy in. That's just to buy in. They have to pay $10 million just to exist in the league. And then it gets even more outrageous when you talk about the Overwatch League, which originally at the start slots were going for $25 million. And now we're seeing expansion slots where they're growing the league, introducing more teams. Those slots are going for even more, upwards of $50 million, just to be able to participate in the league. And then we're also seeing a very similar thing to the Overwatch League with the Call of Duty League, as I mentioned, both managed by Activision Blizzard. So they are charging tens of millions of dollars just to get in and to participate. The problem is that along with being at the start 10 million, 20, 25 million, upwards of $50 million in the hole, on top of that, you still have to pay the players. And we talked about how much they're making. You have to pay for travel for them and things of that nature. And so they're just spending an enormous amount of money to participate, to function. But the reason that this is a bad thing and that it's not justified is because the leagues and the teams do not have the sponsorship money, the advertising, the whatever, to back up that price, because they don't have, for example, the Overwatch League. Teams buy in 20, 25 million or more for expansion teams. When you think about 12, I think it's roughly 12 teams in the league, if not more at this point, 12 teams all paying upwards of $25 million. How is the league going to manage to get sponsorship money that they can bring to the teams and say, look, this is money from sponsorships that they're giving us because the league is successful, and this is where you're going to get your return on investment? It's not happening. Corporations are simply not investing that much money in esports in terms of sponsorships. And it's just crazy because you have 12 plus teams in the Overwatch League, let's just say each bought in for 20 million, the league itself is not even worth, and that's where we get to the cost to buy it is more than its actual worth. The league itself is not even worth 20 million for just because of sponsorships. They don't have that much to justify that cost. So, that's just one team. There's 12, 13 others that are invested with that much as well. And it's just a massive influx of money into these leagues with nothing backing it up. There's nothing within the leagues that makes that money make sense. And investors, thus, and teams, in most cases, in very rare cases, there are teams that are very well established. They have good branding, they have good players, they have a long tenured history in esports. Some teams are making money in esports. That is very rare. An insider in the industry did an interview with Kotaku where she said that the amount of, and she's worked with teams in their financial aspects. She said that the number of teams losing money in esports is close to 90%. So, and that comes from things like franchise league and player salaries, because they're just burning money without getting it back. They're not getting that return on investment, despite Riot Games, the publisher of League of Legends, owner of the LCS. They're like, hey, you'll get this money back eventually, just not right now. And the same thing with Overwatch League and Call of Duty League. They're being promised a return on investment eventually, and that, oh, it's great, it'll keep growing. But the numbers show that is a very long way off, very long way off. So we're in a bubble because of overpaying for franchise spots and for player salaries. So what happens? What happens as a result of this bubble? A major theory is that it will burst. Like bubbles, they burst. You know that. And the reason it bursts is because investors, these people that have put tens and hundreds of millions of dollars into esports, naturally, as business people, they want to make money back eventually. But with esports, what we're finding is that, like I said, people are not making money in a vast majority of cases. So the worry is that the investors, for the most part, the people on the outside that invested the very large amounts, these people are going to say, look, we're not making any money, and we've been here for years. What's the deal? And they'll get frustrated, they'll grow impatient, and then that is when they pull all their money out. And esports very quickly, in the span of weeks, months, loses hundreds of millions of dollars of its infrastructure, if you will, of its backbone. And it's not, and the funny thing is that it's not even really a backbone, because those investments aren't even justified, but it will lose that money altogether, which would set back the industry of esports for years. People have said maybe a few years, maybe a decade or more, that esports will take, because the investors lose confidence in the industry, so they leave. It will take a long time for investors to regain that confidence in esports, to be able to invest that money again. So that's when it bursts, when they leave, and esports is set back for years, because they just don't, the money has run out. And a lot of the original people that have been in it since the beginning, they're still there, they're still trying, but they don't have the backing of the big money people that have left. So that is why esports is in a bubble. That's what's happened. Those are the two main factors causing it. The high player salaries, the franchise leagues, and those things. And, the theory, like I said, is by many people that this is unsustainable and that we will have to correct it in the near future. So I hope that all made sense. I hope it was at least entertaining, at least educational, and that you learned something interesting. So I want to thank everybody for watching, and have a fantastic day.